I never thought it would come to this. When Mia first brought it up, I thought she was joking, pushing boundaries just to see how I'd react. But the idea clung to her, circling back into conversation over the next few days until I could no longer pretend it was a joke. It all started on a regular evening in our small apartment. The city lights streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow over the living room where Mia and her best friend, Sophie, sat laughing together on the couch. They'd always been close, sharing secrets and jokes that I was never fully a part of. It was something I'd come to accept in the years I'd been with Mia. Their friendship was a constant, a foundation that ran deep, one I could never really touch. But that night, something shifted. Sophie was staying over, nothing unusual for a weekend. We often spent time together, the three of us. But as the night dragged on, and the wine flowed freely, I noticed a subtle change in the air. Mia's glances were different, lingering longer, her voice soft and teasing in a way I hadn't heard before. And then there was Sophie, her laughter quieter, her eyes meeting mine in fleeting moments that seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite understand. Mia turned to me suddenly, her hand resting lightly on my arm, and I could see that look in her eyes, the one she gave when she was about to propose something crazy, something she was daring me to consider. "I have an idea," she said, her voice low, almost playful. I raised an eyebrow, already feeling the knot of tension forming in my stomach. "What kind of idea?" She bit her lip, glancing at Sophie before turning back to me. "What if we took things a little further tonight?" I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Mia's smile was slow, deliberate. "You know what I mean. We've talked about it before." She tilted her head towards Sophie, whose expression was hard to read, her eyes darting between us. I felt a surge of heat rise in my chest, confusion swirling in my mind. We had talked about it, half-joking conversations where Mia teased the idea of bringing someone else into our relationship. But it was always hypothetical, a fantasy, something I never imagined would become real. "Mia," I started, unsure how to respond. My eyes flickered to Sophie, who was sitting so still, her glass of wine cradled in her hands as if she were waiting for something. "What do you think, babe?" Mia pressed, her fingers tracing small circles on my arm, her voice softer now, coaxing. "Just this once. No pressure. I think it could be fun." The room felt suddenly too small, the weight of her words settling over me like a thick fog. My gaze shifted to Sophie again, and for the first time, I noticed the way her body was tense, the way her lips parted slightly as if she was about to say something but held back. She wasn't just an observer. She was part of this, too, waiting, watching. "Mia, I don't know," I mumbled, my throat dry. "This is a lot to take in." Mia leaned closer, her breath warm against my ear. "I trust you, and I trust Sophie. Don't you?" Sophie finally spoke, her voice soft and unsure. "We don't have to do anything if you're not comfortable, Liam." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the same flicker of uncertainty in her eyes that I felt in my own chest. But there was something else, too, something that mirrored Mia's desire. Sophie wasn't just going along with this because Mia suggested it. There was something more beneath the surface, something I hadn't seen before. The tension between the three of us was thick now, almost palpable. Mia's hand slid down my arm, her touch light but insistent. I could feel her expectation, the thrill of pushing boundaries, but what unnerved me most was the way Sophie seemed to be caught in the same current, her gaze locked on mine with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Liam," Mia said softly, her fingers brushing the back of my neck. "Just trust us." My heart pounded, my mind racing through a dozen different thoughts at once. This was Mia, the woman I loved, asking me to cross a line I had never imagined stepping over. And Sophie, Mia's best friend, was right there, drawn into the same orbit. I glanced at Mia, then at Sophie. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. Sophie nodded, her lips parting slightly. "Only if you want to." The room seemed to shrink, the space between us charged with an intensity that made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the way Mia's fingers lingered on my neck, the way Sophie's eyes followed every small movement I made. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to stop this before it began, but my body stayed rooted to the spot, caught in the pull of something I couldn't quite name. There was a silence, long and heavy, before I finally spoke. "Okay," I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. The room seemed to hum with a tension I hadn't anticipated. My heart raced, and the silence stretched on, thick and heavy, before Mia broke it. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing down my arm with a tenderness that belied the intensity of what was happening. Sophie's eyes met mine again, just for a moment, and I could see her struggling with the same confusion, the same storm of emotions that had overtaken me. Mia shifted closer to me on the couch, her body pressing against mine in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. I had always loved the way she touched me, the way her presence grounded me, but tonight, it felt different, charged with an undercurrent of something darker, something more uncertain. "Let's take it slow," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. She glanced at Sophie, who hadn't moved, her eyes still flickering with uncertainty. Sophie shifted slightly, her legs crossing as she adjusted her position on the couch, her body tense but her gaze soft. "We don't have to rush anything," she added, her voice quiet, as if she were reassuring herself as much as me. Mia nodded, her hand sliding down to my chest, her touch light but deliberate. "Just let it happen, Liam. No pressure." I swallowed hard, trying to calm the storm inside me. My mind was racing, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me, but there was something about the way Mia looked at me, something in her eyes that made it impossible to pull away. I felt torn between my loyalty to her and the new, undeniable pull toward Sophie, the woman who had been her best friend for years. I could feel Sophie watching us, the air between the three of us thick with an unspoken tension. Her gaze lingered on Mia's hand, now resting on my chest, and I could see the flicker of something in her expression: desire, hesitation, guilt. The same emotions that were swirling inside me. Mia leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "It's just us. No one has to know." I hesitated, my pulse racing as my gaze flickered to Sophie. She looked back at me, her lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. The connection between us, so subtle, so forbidden, was there, lingering beneath the surface. It had always been there, I realized. I just hadn't let myself see it before tonight. Mia kissed my cheek softly, her lips barely brushing my skin, but it was enough to pull me back into the moment, into the heat of her body pressed against mine. I could feel the weight of her expectations, the way she wanted me to let go, to follow her lead. And yet my gaze kept drifting back to Sophie, who sat so still, so quiet, watching, waiting. Sophie shifted again, her body moving slightly closer, her leg brushing mine as she did. It was such a small movement, so subtle, but the touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, heightening the tension that had been building all night. I couldn't ignore the way her presence affected me, the way her proximity made my skin tingle with anticipation. Mia's fingers slid up to my neck, her touch gentle, almost teasing. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with something deeper, something more urgent. I nodded, my throat tight, my breath shallow. "Yeah," I managed, though my voice felt distant, like it didn't belong to me. Mia smiled, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, her eyes dark with desire. "Good." And then she turned to Sophie, her hand still resting on my chest, but her gaze locked on her friend. "Sophie," she said, her voice low and coaxing. "Come closer." Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering to mine before she moved, inching closer until her leg was pressed against mine. I could feel the warmth of her body, the tension radiating from her, and it sent a thrill through me that I couldn't deny. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away before we crossed the line, but my body stayed rooted in place, caught in the pull of the moment, in the gravity of what was happening between us. Mia's hand slipped from my neck, her fingers brushing over my shoulder, as she leaned back slightly, giving Sophie more space, more room to join us. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent communication that passed in the way they looked at each other, the way Mia's lips curled into a slow, encouraging smile. Sophie moved closer still, her breath hitching slightly as she sat beside me, her leg pressed fully against mine now, the heat between us undeniable. I could feel her trembling slightly, the same uncertainty and desire that was coursing through me mirrored in her every movement. Mia leaned back, her hands slipping away from me entirely as she watched us, her eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name, excitement, maybe, or anticipation. She wasn't just leading this. She was watching, waiting to see what would happen next, letting Sophie and I fall into this moment together. I turned to Sophie, my heart pounding, and for the first time, I let myself really look at her. She was beautiful in a way that was different from Mia, softer, more hesitant, but no less intense. There was something about the way she held herself, the way her lips parted slightly as our eyes met, that made my breath catch in my throat. "Sophie," I whispered, unsure of what to say, unsure of where this was going. But she just looked at me, her gaze steady now, her hand inching closer to mine, as if testing the boundaries between us. Her fingers brushed mine, and the touch was so light, so tentative, but it sent a shockwave through me, igniting something I hadn't realized was there before. The connection between us was real, undeniable, and it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. Sophie's hand slipped into mine, her fingers curling around mine gently, and the simple act made my heart race even faster. I could feel Mia watching us, the weight of her gaze heavy on my skin, but I couldn't look away from Sophie. There was something between us now, something that had been building quietly for years, and now it was coming to the surface, impossible to ignore. Mia shifted beside us, her presence still there, still guiding, but she didn't interrupt. She let it happen, let Sophie and I fall into this strange, forbidden connection. And for a moment, it was just the two of us, our hands entwined, our breaths shallow, the room around us fading into the background. Sophie leaned in slightly, her lips so close to mine now, and my mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away before we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, Sophie closed the distance, her lips brushing mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was so light, so fleeting, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through my entire body, igniting a fire that I had been trying to suppress all night. I kissed her back, just as softly, just as tentatively, my mind spinning, my heart racing. I could feel Mia's presence beside us, the way her breath hitched slightly as she watched, but she didn't intervene. She let it happen, let the moment unfold, and I knew then that there was no going back. Sophie pulled back slightly, her breath shaky, her eyes searching mine for something, reassurance, maybe, or understanding. I didn't know what she was looking for, but I knew what I felt. The connection between us was real, and it terrified me as much as it excited me. Mia's hand slipped between us, resting lightly on my chest, her touch grounding me in the moment. "See?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with something deeper. "It's okay." But was it? Was any of this okay? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't stop now. Not when the line had already been crossed. Not when the fire between Sophie and me had already been ignited. Sophie's lips were still tingling on mine, the warmth of her kiss lingering like a secret we just shared. She pulled back slightly, her breathing shallow, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my heart race. Mia's hand rested on my chest, her fingers tracing light, lazy circles over my skin, but her gaze was fixed on Sophie, watching, waiting. It was Mia who spoke first, breaking the fragile silence. "You see?" she whispered, her voice soft and filled with something I couldn't quite understand. "It's okay, Liam." Sophie's gaze flickered toward Mia, and for a moment, the two of them shared a look that I couldn't decipher. It wasn't just friendship anymore, or even the intimacy of years spent side by side. There was something unspoken passing between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a boundary they were silently pushing together. My mind was a mess, thoughts crashing against one another like waves in a storm. I had kissed Sophie. Mia had watched. And now, I was sitting here, torn between the woman I loved and the undeniable connection I had just felt with her best friend. It was a reality I hadn't thought possible, one that felt surreal and impossible to navigate. Mia leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my neck now, a subtle reminder of her presence, of the control she still had over this situation. I turned toward her instinctively, her familiar scent grounding me, but my mind kept pulling me back to Sophie, who was still sitting so close, her hand brushing against mine as if she wasn't sure what to do next. Mia's lips moved against my skin, slow and deliberate, sending shivers down my spine. She was always good at this, knowing just how to touch me, just how to keep me tethered to her even when my mind was spiraling. "I want you to relax," she whispered, her voice coaxing, soothing. "Just let go. I'm here." Her words felt like a lifeline, and yet, they only made the weight of the moment heavier. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze, and saw something in her eyes that both reassured and unsettled me. She wanted this. She wanted me to want it too. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I tried to make sense of everything. "Mia, I don't know if..." But she pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me gently. "Shh," she murmured. "You're overthinking it, babe. Just let it happen." I glanced at Sophie, whose gaze was still fixed on me, her eyes wide with something that looked like both desire and uncertainty. She had been quiet, almost too quiet, but the tension between us was palpable. I could feel it in the way her hand lingered near mine, the way her body seemed to gravitate toward me without her even realizing it. Mia pulled back slightly, her lips curling into a soft smile as she looked between us. "Sophie," she said, her voice low and inviting. "Do you want to?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, before she nodded. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said enough. The unspoken desire that had been building all night was there, right on the surface, and now it was about to spill over. Mia's hand moved to mine, guiding me towards Sophie's. Our fingers brushed, and the contact sent another jolt through me, as if my entire body was waking up to something I had been ignoring for too long. Sophie's hand was soft, her touch tentative but deliberate, and I felt my pulse quicken as her fingers intertwined with mine. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the three of us, the room around us fading into the background. The sounds of the city outside were distant now, muffled by the weight of what was happening between us. It was just me, Mia, and Sophie, caught in a moment that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. Mia leaned back into the couch, her hand resting on my thigh now, her touch gentle but firm. "It's okay," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to be afraid." But I was afraid. I was terrified of what this meant, of what we were doing, of the consequences we'd have to face once this was over. And yet I couldn't stop. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable to ignore. Sophie shifted closer, her leg brushing against mine as she moved, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, the tension crackling between us like a live wire. And then, without another word, she leaned in again, her lips finding mine in a kiss that was both soft and urgent, filled with the unspoken desire we had been trying to suppress all night. This time, I didn't hesitate. I kissed her back, my hands slipping into her hair as I pulled her closer, the taste of her lips sending a wave of heat through me. Mia's hand stayed on my thigh, a constant reminder of her presence, but I couldn't focus on anything except Sophie, the way her body pressed against mine, the way her kiss deepened, the way her fingers curled into my shirt as if she were holding on for dear life. It was surreal, kissing Sophie like this, knowing that Mia was right there, watching, guiding. But it wasn't just Mia anymore. It was Sophie too. It was the way her breath hitched when our lips met, the way her body moved instinctively toward mine, the way she made me feel something I hadn't expected to feel. We pulled apart after what felt like an eternity, both of us breathing hard, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. My mind was spinning, the reality of what was happening crashing over me like a tidal wave, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Mia's voice broke through the haze, soft but filled with something deeper, something darker. "That was beautiful," she murmured, her hand moving up my thigh now, her touch sending shivers down my spine. "You two look so good together." I turned to her, my heart pounding, and saw the same desire in her eyes that I had seen in Sophie's. She wasn't just a spectator in this. She was part of it too. She had been from the very beginning. Mia leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft but insistent, as if she were reminding me that she was still here, still the one in control. I kissed her back, my mind spinning, my body caught between the two women who had somehow pulled me into this web of desire and confusion. When she pulled away, her eyes flickered back to Sophie. "Do you want to take it further?" she asked, her voice low and intimate. Sophie's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded, her gaze darting to me, searching for reassurance, for confirmation that this was really happening. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I looked between the two of them. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the whirlwind of emotions crashing through me. But I knew one thing for certain: we had already crossed the line, and there was no going back now. Mia's hand slipped into mine, her fingers squeezing gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're all in this together." And just like that, the room seemed to shift again, the tension between us growing thicker, heavier. Sophie moved closer, her body pressing against mine, and Mia's hand stayed firmly in mine, guiding me through this moment that felt both inevitable and impossible all at once. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Sophie's body pressed closer to mine, and the world seemed to slow down around us. I could feel the weight of her against me, her warmth, the way her breathing quickened as our connection deepened. Mia's presence was still there, a constant reminder that this wasn't just between Sophie and me, but something more complex, a triangle of emotions and desires that none of us fully understood. Mia leaned back, her eyes scanning our faces, watching as the tension between Sophie and me crackled like a live wire. "It's okay," she whispered again, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. "Just let it happen." But even as Mia's words lingered in the air, I could feel the conflict tearing me apart inside. The guilt gnawed at me, twisting in my chest like a knot that refused to loosen. I knew Mia had given her blessing, that she had initiated this, but that didn't make it any easier to reconcile what was happening. Sophie was Mia's best friend, the person she trusted most in the world. And here I was, caught between the two of them, feeling something for Sophie that I had never expected, something I wasn't sure I could handle. Sophie's hand slid up my arm, her touch light but deliberate, and the simple gesture sent a shiver down my spine. She leaned in again, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, filled with the same uncertainty I felt. I kissed her back, my mind spinning with the weight of what we were doing, the line we had already crossed. Mia's hand moved to my shoulder, squeezing gently, as if to reassure me that this was okay. But nothing about this felt okay. It felt like I was being pulled in two directions at once, toward Mia, the woman I loved, and toward Sophie, the woman I had never realized I could feel something for. Sophie pulled back, her breath shaky, her eyes wide as she searched my face for something, reassurance, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. But I had none of those things to give. I didn't know how to make sense of what I was feeling, how to reconcile the desire coursing through me with the guilt that twisted in my chest. Sophie started, her voice trembling. She glanced at Mia, then back at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and longing. "Maybe we should stop." Mia shifted beside us, her hand slipping from my shoulder as she sat back, her gaze still locked on Sophie. "Only if that's what you want," she said softly, her voice calm, almost soothing. "We don't have to stop if you don't want to." Sophie hesitated, her eyes flicking to me again, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. She was torn, just like I was. Torn between the desire that had built between us, and the reality of what this meant for all of us. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sophie," I started, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to navigate this, how to make sense of the mess we had created. All I knew was that I didn't want to hurt either of them. But that was impossible now. Someone was going to get hurt. We all were. Sophie looked at me, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but then she closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." Mia reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's okay," she said again, her voice filled with a quiet reassurance. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." But Sophie pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "No, it's not okay," she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. She stood up, taking a step back from the couch, her eyes wide with emotion. This isn't right. I can't do this." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension that had been building all night suddenly replaced by something colder, something more final. Sophie's words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me, suffocating me. Mia stood up, moving towards Sophie, her expression soft but filled with concern. "Sophie, it's okay. We don't have to." But Sophie shook her head again, cutting her off. "No, Mia, it's not okay. I can't do this to you. To us." Her voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the guilt and confusion finally breaking through. Mia reached for her, but Sophie stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I shouldn't have let it get this far." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with so much emotion it made my chest ache. "I'm sorry, Liam. I shouldn't have." And then she turned, walking quickly toward the door, leaving Mia and me standing in the middle of the room, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on us like a wave. The silence that followed was deafening. Mia stood there, staring at the door, her hands still outstretched as if she could pull Sophie back, but she didn't move. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, her shoulders tense, her breath shaky. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to tell her that it would be okay, that we would figure this out. But the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make this better. I wasn't sure if I could. Finally, Mia let out a long breath, her hand falling to her side as she turned to face me. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment, or maybe something deeper, something I couldn't understand. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't want it to end like this." Mia shook her head, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "We all made choices tonight." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Do you think we'll be okay?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of the question. Mia didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with so many emotions that I couldn't untangle them. And then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I really don't know." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. The truth was, I didn't know either. I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way things were before. I didn't know if we could move past what had happened tonight, or if it would always hang between us, a shadow we couldn't shake. Mia reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, but her touch felt different now, less certain, less sure. "We'll figure it out," she said, but there was a tremor in her voice that made me doubt her words. We stood there for a long time, the silence between us heavy and unresolved. The future was uncertain, and the connection that had once been so strong between us now felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Sophie was gone, but her presence still lingered, a ghost between us, haunting the space where we stood. I didn't know if we could move past this, didn't know if our relationship could survive the weight of what we had done. And as I stood there, holding Mia's hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us would never be the same again.